Welcome to the podcast de Philippe. We're going deep today, exploring a comparison that's fascinating and maybe a little unsettling.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to analyze how Hitler consolidated his power in just 53 days.
Okay.
And then look at some parallels.
Yeah.
And also crucial differences with Donald Trump's political actions, both past and present. This isn't about saying they're the same.
Right.
It's more about looking at historical patterns and asking, what can we learn? And how can we protect democratic institutions today? Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like the video to support le podcast de Philippe. On analyse avec nos alliés Hitler et Donald Trump dans leurs décisions politiques. Et ça fait peur.
It's a sensitive comparison for sure,
Huh.
but an important one,
Yeah.
especially given what's happening right now. Understanding how small steps can really erode democratic norms is crucial for protecting those norms today.
Yeah. Let's go back to 1933, Germany.
Yeah.
So Hitler becomes chancellor on January 30th.
Okay.
Not a dictator yet, but the next 53 days are key.
Yeah.
We have the Reichstag fire on February 27th.
Right.
A Dutch communist is blamed, but the Nazis use it to accuse the whole Communist Party of plotting against the state.
Right. Yeah. That's where the Reichstag fire decree comes in. Hitler convinces President Hindenburg to sign it.
Right.
And this suspends civil liberties like freedom of the press and assembly.
Wow.
This allowed the Nazis to arrest their political opponents, mainly communists and socialists. The important thing here is that this decree bypassed the legal framework, setting a precedent for rule by decree rather than through, established democratic processes.
So even after this, the Nazi Party didn't get a majority in the March 5th elections.
Right.
Only 43.9% of the vote. It
Wow.
wasn't just brute force. There was political maneuvering, too.
Yeah.
Hitler formed a coalition with the nationalist DNVP party, but even that wasn't enough for absolute power.
Right. And that's a key difference between the Weimar Republic and the U.S. system.
Okay.
The Weimar Constitution had some weaknesses that Hitler exploited.
Right.
Article 48, for example, allowed the president to rule by decree in emergencies.
Oh, interesting.
A power that had been used more and more in the years leading up to Hitler becoming chancellor.
So it was kind of already normalized.
Exactly. It normalized bypassing parliament, making it easier for Hitler to do the same.
Then we have the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933, granting Hitler dictatorial powers for 4 years.
Right.
He could now make laws without Parliament's approval,
Wow.
further suppressing opposition.
Yeah.
This single act, passed by a terrified Parliament, dismantled the fragile checks and balances of the Weimar Republic.
And it's important to remember the Enabling Act was passed legally through
Right.
the existing system,
Right.
but by exploiting fear and manipulating procedures.
Right.
This really shows that just having laws or institutions isn't enough.
Yeah.
It's the commitment to those laws, the public's understanding of their importance, and the willingness to defend them.
Yeah.
That truly protects a democracy.
So now let's shift to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Are there any echoes of these patterns in his actions? Just to be clear, we are not equating Trump with Hitler, but looking at potential parallels
Yeah,
is important for understanding how fragile democratic norms can be.
absolutely.
For example, on his first day back in office in 2025, Trump signed a record 26 executive orders.
Oh.
Many of them were aimed at reversing policies from the previous administration.
And then there's the firing of 17 independent inspectors general.
Right.
Those are the people in charge of oversight of government agencies.
Yeah.
That raised some serious concerns about transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
These actions might not be as extreme as the Reichstag fire decree,
Sure.
but they do show how executive power can be concentrated and
Right.
used to bypass the usual checks and balances.
And then there's the targeting of political opponents.
Right.
After the Reichstag fire, Hitler went after communists and socialists.
Yeah.
And Trump, during his presidency and even now, has called his opponents things like enemies, traitors, or even deep state operatives.
Right.
This kind of talk dehumanizes opponents
Yeah.
and makes civil discussion impossible.
Exactly. And the pardoning of around 1,500 people involved in the January 6th Capitol riot,
Right.
including members of extremist groups,
Yep.
along with firing Justice Department officials involved in investigations against him,
Right.
that just fuels those concerns even more.
Yeah.
It raises questions about whether loyalty is more important than the rule of law.
Right.
And it could even undermine faith in the justice system itself.
Another striking parallel is the constant attacks on the press.
Oh, absolutely.
Hitler had Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda machine. Trump has repeatedly labeled outlets like CNN and the New York Times as fake news,
Right.
and this encourages his supporters to distrust any media that doesn't agree with his views.
This strategy of discrediting trustworthy news sources
Right.
while promoting alternative, often very partisan media outlets,
Yeah.
it's a classic move from the authoritarian playbook.
Right.
The goal is to control the narrative, sow distrust in established institutions,
Mm-hmm.
and make it hard for people to tell what's true and what's false.
And this control of the narrative is then used to influence the elections themselves.
Exactly.
While Hitler rigged elections after he consolidated power.
Right.
Trump's efforts have been more about sowing distrust in the system itself.
Yeah.
His constant claims of a stolen election in 2020, even though there's no evidence of widespread fraud,
Right.
have eroded people's confidence in the democratic process.
And those claims have had a real impact.
Yeah.
A large portion of the population now believes that elections are rigged against them.
It's a dangerous idea.
It is incredibly dangerous. It creates an atmosphere of cynicism and distrust,
Yeah.
making it easier for those in power to manipulate the system for their own benefit.
And we can't ignore the cult of personality surrounding both figures.
No, you can't.
Both of them created an image of themselves as saviors,
Right.
the only ones who could fix their nation's problems.
Mm,
They used rallies and speeches to create almost religious devotion among their followers,
yeah.
demanding absolute loyalty and demonizing anyone who disagreed.
That's
It's really...
It's a powerful and dangerous tactic.
Yeah, it is.
It preys on fear, anger, and resentment, creating a fertile ground for the erosion of democratic norm.
It's interesting how the historical context is so different,
Yeah.
but the strategies they used seem to have this chilling similarity.
It is striking.
How can we as citizens distinguish between legitimate concerns
Right.
and these manipulative tactics designed to undermine our institutions?
That's the key question. One important difference lies in the intent and the methods.
Okay.
A healthy democracy encourages debate,
Yeah.
welcomes different viewpoints,
Uh-huh.
and relies on facts and evidence.
Okay.
When leaders consistently demonize their opponents, spread misinformation,
Right.
and try to undermine the legitimacy of institutions,
Yeah.
that's a red flag.
So beyond the rhetoric, let's look at some specific actions that Trump took.
Okay.
Actions that sparked debate and concern.
Right.
His immigration policies, particularly his attempt to end birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
And the separation of families at the border
Yeah.
drew a lot of criticism both in the U.S. and internationally.
Yeah. These actions raise important questions about the balance between national security and human rights.
Right.
Critics argued that these policies targeted specific groups based on their ethnicity and origin, which echoes discriminatory practices from the past.
And then there's the withdrawal from international agreements,
right.
like the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Agreement,
Yes.
which some saw as a retreat from global cooperation
Yeah.
and putting nationalistic interests first.
These withdrawals definitely signaled a change in America's role in the world
Right.
and raised concerns about the consequences for international stability and cooperation on critical issues like climate change.
Trump's approach to trade, with tariffs imposed on goods from countries like China and Mexico,
Right.
also caused a lot of debate.
Yeah.
Supporters said it protected American jobs, but critics warned of economic damage and harm to international relations.
The trade wars that started because of these tariffs
Yeah.
had a mixed impact on the U.S. economy.
Okay.
And some economists believe that they ended up hurting American businesses and consumers more than they helped.
Interesting.
The bigger worry was that these actions were a move away from free trade principles
Right.
and towards protectionism,
Okay.
a policy that has historically been linked to economic decline and geopolitical instability.
And speaking of economic decline, many argue that Trump's tax cuts,
Yes.
which mostly benefited corporations and wealthy people,
Right.
made income inequality worse and didn't really stimulate broad economic growth.
The impact of those tax cuts is still being debated.
Okay.
But there is evidence that they contributed to a widening wealth gap
Right.
and didn't lead to the promised increase in investment and job creation.
So this brings us to another important point in this comparison. How did Trump's policies affect democratic norms and how the government functions?
That's a crucial point.
Critics argue that his administration's frequent clashes with the judiciary,
Right?
attempts to discredit the intelligence community, and attacks on the free press
Yeah.
undermined public trust in these vital institutions.
And these concerns weren't just coming from one side of the political spectrum.
Right.
Several former Republican officials and conservative commentators were also alarmed by what they saw.
Interesting.
They were worried about the disregard for the rule of law
Yeah.
and a dangerous erosion of democratic norms.
It's also worth noting that a lot of Trump's actions faced legal challenges.
They did.
and met resistance from both within the government and from civil society organizations.
Absolutely.
This shows that the U.S. system of checks and balances,
Yeah.
while not perfect,
Right.
was still working to some degree.
That's a crucial point. The U.S. system, unlike the Weimar Republic, has a more robust framework for challenging executive power.
Okay.
The courts, Congress, the media, despite facing pressure and attacks,
Yeah.
still played a role in holding the administration accountable.
But the question is, were these checks and balances enough to prevent lasting damage
Right.
to our democratic norms and institutions?
That's the big question.
And what lessons can we learn from this tumultuous period in American history?
That's where the comparison with Hitler becomes really important.
Okay.
Not as a prediction of the same outcome,
Right.
but as a warning.
Okay.
It reminds us that backsliding in a democracy can happen gradually
Yeah.
through seemingly small compromises and erosions of norms.
Right.
It underscores the need for vigilance, for active citizenship, and for a deep understanding of the principles that make a free and open society possible.
And maybe most importantly,
Yeah,
it makes us ask ourselves, how can we strengthen those institutions?
that's the question.
How can we rebuild public trust?
Right,
And how can we make sure that what happened in the past doesn't happen again?
absolutely. These are the questions we need to be asking ourselves
Okay.
and actively working to answer if we
Yeah.
want to safeguard our democracy.
Well said. We'll be back after a short break.
Sounds good. It's a type of leadership that really thrives on this like simplistic us versus them mentality where, complexity and nuance are just tossed aside in favor of this narrative that pits one group against another.
Right.
It preys on fear, anger, resentment, creating fertile ground for the erosion of those democratic norms.
It's interesting because while the historical context is so different,
Yeah,
the strategies they used seem to share this chilling similarity.
it is striking.
How can we as citizens, distinguish between legitimate concerns and these manipulative tactics
Right.
that are designed to undermine our institutions?
That's the key question, isn't it? One important difference is in the intent and the methods.
Okay.
A healthy democracy encourages debate, welcomes different viewpoints, and relies on facts and evidence.
Right.
When leaders consistently demonize their opponents, spread misinformation, and try to undermine the legitimacy of institutions, that's a red flag.
So beyond just the rhetoric, let's look at some specific actions that Trump took
Okay.
that sparked debate and concern.
Right.
His immigration policies,
Yes.
particularly his attempt to end birthright citizenship,
Right.
and the separation of families at the border
Yeah.
drew a lot of criticism, both in the U.S. and internationally.
Yeah, they did. These actions raise important questions about the balance between national security and human rights.
Right.
Critics argue that these policies targeted specific groups based on their ethnicity and origin,
Right.
echoing discriminatory practices from the past.
And then you have the withdrawal from international agreements,
Right.
like the World Health Organization
Yeah.
and the Paris Climate Agreement,
Yes.
which some saw as a retreat from global cooperation and putting America first.
Those withdrawals definitely signaled a change in America's role in the world
Right.
and raised concerns about what it meant for international stability and cooperation, especially on critical issues like climate change.
Trump's approach to trade, with the tariffs on goods from China and Mexico,
Right.
also sparked a lot of debate.
They did.
Supporters argued that it protected American jobs,
Right.
while critics warned of economic repercussions and damage to international relations.
The trade wars that those tariffs started,
Yeah.
they had a mixed impact on the U.S. economy.
Okay.
And some economists say that they ended up hurting American businesses and consumers more than helping.
Interesting.
But the bigger worry was that these actions signaled a shift away from free trade
Right.
and towards protectionism,
Uh-huh.
which historically has been linked to economic decline and geopolitical instability.
And speaking of economic decline, many people argue that Trump's tax cuts,
Yeah.
which mainly benefited corporations and wealthy individuals,
Right.
actually worsened income inequality
Okay.
and didn't really boost broad economic growth. The impact of those tax cuts is still being debated,
Right.
but there's evidence to suggest that they contributed to the growing wealth gap.
Right. And didn't lead to the surge in investment and job creation that was promised.
This brings us to another key aspect of this comparison.
Okay.
How did Trump's policies impact democratic norms and the way the government works?
That's a crucial question.
Critics argue that his administration's frequent clashes with the judiciary.
Yeah.
The attempts to discredit the intelligence community and the attacks on the free press really undermine public trust in these essential institutions.
And these concerns weren't limited to one side of the political aisle.
Right.
A number of former Republican officials and conservative commentators expressed real alarm at what they saw.
What were they concerned about?
Well, they saw a disregard for the rule of law and this dangerous erosion of democratic norms.
It's important to note that many of Trump's actions faced legal challenges.
They did.
And met resistance from both within the government and from civil society organizations.
Absolutely. This demonstrates that the U.S. system of checks and balances, though imperfect, was still functioning to some degree.
So it was still working.
It was still working. The U.S. system, unlike the Weimar Republic, has a more robust framework for challenging executive power. The courts, Congress, the media, despite facing pressure and attacks, they still played a role in holding the administration accountable.
But the question remains, were these checks and balances enough to prevent lasting damage?
Right. That's the big question.
To democratic norms and institutions.
Yeah.
And what lessons can we learn from this period in American history?
That's where the comparison with Hitler becomes most relevant, I think.
Yeah.
Not as a prediction that the same thing will happen, but as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that democratic backsliding can happen in subtle ways through what seem like small compromises and the erosion of norms. It highlights how important vigilance is, active citizenship, and a deep understanding of the principles that underpin a free and open society.
And perhaps most importantly, it forces us to ask ourselves, how can we strengthen our institutions? How can we rebuild trust? And how can we prevent the mistakes of the past from happening again?
Those are the crucial questions. We need to be asking ourselves these questions and actively seeking answers.
Absolutely.
If we truly want to protect our democracy.
Welcome back to Le Podcast de Philippe. We've been talking about some uncomfortable parallels between Hitler's rise and Donald Trump's actions. But like we said, context is really important. The U.S. in 2025 is not Germany in the 1930s. We have different institutions, a different history, and hopefully a different future.
We do. The U.S. has a strong tradition of democratic principles and a system of checks and balances designed to prevent too much power in one place. We have a free press, an independent judiciary, and a robust civil society.
But those safeguards are only as strong as our commitment to them.
That's right. If we become complacent and allow those norms to erode, we become vulnerable.
So true democracy isn't static, right?
No, it's not.
It's something that needs to be constantly defended and nurtured.
Absolutely.
It requires active participation, critical thinking, and a willingness to hold those in power accountable. Given everything we've discussed, what does this all mean for us today? What can we do to protect our democracy from these kinds of threats?
Well, I think education is key. We need to understand how these tactics work, how propaganda and disinformation can manipulate people. We need to be critical of the information we consume and seek out different perspectives.
And engage in civil discourse.
Absolutely. Even with people who have different opinions than our own. We need to have those discussions based on reason and evidence, not personal attacks or trying to demonize each other.
We have to rebuild trust.
Yes, we need to rebuild trust in each other and in our institutions.
How do we do that?
It takes open communication, empathy, and a willingness to listen to perspectives that challenge our own.
And shouldn't we be supporting those organizations that are working to protect democratic values?
Absolutely. The groups that are fighting for things like voting rights, freedom of the press, accountability and transparency in government.
They're doing really important work.
They are. They play a vital role in holding power accountable and making sure our democratic institutions stay strong.
So the parallels between Hitler and Trump might be unsettling.
They are.
But they remind us how important it is to be vigilant, to be engaged, and to actively participate in shaping the future of our democracy.
The future isn't set in stone. We create it. Through our choices, our actions, and our willingness to stand up for what we believe in.
Really well said. It's a call to action for all of us. Well, that wraps up this deep dive here on Le Podcast de Philippe. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like the video. Thanks for listening.